Hey friends, I'm Greg Nettle, and I serve as president of Stadia Church Planting as well as the host of the Church Planting Podcast. We have an amazing guest today, one of my favorites, Mozart Dixon. He serves as the director of church multiplication for the Metro District of the Christian and Missionary Alliance. He's been in vocational ministry for nearly 14 years in various capacities, from college ministry to church planting. Mozart co-planted a church 6 years ago that just absolutely took off, planted multiple church, and became just kind of a textbook for how church planting is supposed to be done. He holds a master's in Christian study, and he's currently working on his doctorate in ministry. Mozart is one of the best strategic thinkers I've been around. Looking forward to this planting podcast episode with Mozart Dixon. Hey friends, I'm so excited to have my friend and advisory team member as well for Stadia, Mozart Dixon, on today's episode of the Church Planting Podcast. Welcome, Mozart.
Thank you, Greg. Pleasure to be here, man.
Yeah. Hey, Mozart, as we've gotten to know each other, really as I've gotten to know you, man, I've just been kind of blown away at your story, church planter, overseeing now, multiplication movement, and certainly your involvement with Stadia on our advisory team and speaking truth and direction into our organization as well. Let's start with just a little bit of your story. I mean, you're a church planter, and all of the crazy things you planted where?
Yeah, I planted in Lincoln, Nebraska. It's where I grew up, so it's a hometown for me. About 2016, me and 8 people met in a living room, kind of the stereotypical story. But we wanted the mission to say, hey, we want to glorify God by multiplying disciples in churches. And by God's grace, we were able to do that several times over, actually. So we had about 3 church plants that were planted out of that within the 4.5 years I was there. But yeah, my family invested deeply in that space, and it's been a rich privilege to see things like that grow and develop. And even as I left, I've seen it continue to do the same thing under the leadership that it has. They've been doing a great job.
Okay, so you started the church with the DNA of multiplication. Talk to us a little bit about that, because a lot of new church starters listening, a lot of church leaders, and how do you embed that DNA of multiplication into a church?
The way we did it was essentially like every aspect of our church had to be thinking multiplication. So that's from when we started out with what we called our city groups or missional communities. We said, hey, this will be a multiplying thing. So once we get to a place of about 20 to 30 people in the room, that means we hopefully have been already multiplying leaders in there and therefore able to multiply groups. And if we multiply groups, then the idea would be that we would multiply churches as well. And so our first campus that we launched out that became a church plant actually was because we had a cluster of groups that had multiplied themselves over the course of a year. And so they were saturating a neighborhood. And so we said, hey, well, why don't we put a church there then, since God's obviously at work there. Same thing with the second one as well. The third one started out as more missional communities in Colorado, because that was a different state. So a little bit harder to do it that way. But a big part of it was saying, hey, if we're going to be about multiplication, it has to be in every aspect of the church, from the children's ministry all the way up to college ministry, and so forth. And so everything was about multiplying disciples, and then also multiplying groups, and then therefore multiplying church as well.
Okay, so in real practical terms, did that mean that in your did you have weekend gathering message that you were just kind of pounding that, built into the values of your church? I mean,
absolutely.
How did you actually transfer that message?
Oh, that's a good question. So yeah, I think so. Like a lot of churches, we do the kind of the core value thing every year, and we talk about core values, down, up, in, and out, which is not a new thing, but a big piece of that is the mission of God and multiplication in that. But then also one of the things that we had to learn along the way is that you get what you celebrate. And so anytime something multiplied, we were celebrating a story of what would take place. So if somebody multiplied themselves in another disciple and there was a baptism, we're going to celebrate that. And that's going to come up in a message of the story, or even just me multiplying myself in my neighborhood, and seeing people come to faith in that space. So yeah, I think the Sunday, it was more trying to drip it in as opposed to it being like a designated message, and just communicating the fact that this is a part of the fabric of what we're doing and not just another component.
Okay, so I get how if there's a baptism, how you're celebrating that multiplication. How did you celebrate, in real time, a children's leader multiplies themselves with another children's leader. Was it stories, or how did you do that?
Sometimes it was stories. Sometimes it was bringing the kids up on stage with the director, our children's director. And one of the things that we really wanted to do is have voice to that. So a lot of times our children's director will come up and talk about the fact that our children don't have small Holy Spirits, but they have the full Holy Spirit. And so she's seeing transformation in them. She's seeing them invest in younger kids as well. And so, yeah, it was trying to be as holistic as possible and get some multiple voices on stage for that too.
Okay, so let's fast forward 4.5 years, and how many people are part of the church now 4 years later?
Sure. So there's about 1,200 at the main church, and then out of the churches that we've multiplied out, each one of them are 200 plus of the other three. They're doing a phenomenal job in the neighborhoods and that sort of thing too.
Okay, so you get to that point. It is really by all standards of new church startups or new startups of anything, incredibly successful. And you and your wife and family are praying through leaving. What's going on in your head at that time, man?
Yeah, man. A lot of things. But I think one of the primary things is just maintaining listening to the voice of the Lord. And one thing that I've always kind of told our staff, even it was a culture of our staff, to say, hey, like, I don't expect you to be here after 3 to 4 years because you've multiplied yourself out into a new church. And that includes our leadership. Our church isn't built on any one person, but on Jesus. And so that means that even I were called to go somewhere else, I'd be willing and open to pray through that. And so my wife, from the time before we got married, made me promise that we would consider moving to New York City if there was ever an opportunity. Me thinking that was a pipe dream, said, yes, absolutely, no problem. And then 10 years later, there's an opportunity that comes from a good friend and mentor of mine to say, hey, like, what do you think about coming out to New York and helping us multiply churches out here? And so in that was because I basically, I mean, obviously, you know this, Greg, you've been sitting in seats like this. You get job offers all the time. Someone's trying to get you to come and do some things for them. And so we've gotten job offers before. And one of the things that our family's always devoted themselves to is, hey, we're going to pray through every opportunity to make sure that God is opening the door and not someone else. And if he wants to close it, he can close it. And so the same was true about this one. And so we had already kind of sensed that eventually I would leave our church, but we were thinking 10 years, not 4.5, 5. But this one came out. We had our missional community affirm it. My mom affirmed it. Our kids affirmed it. All these people said, yeah, this makes sense. Now they didn't like it, of course. They weren't trying to push us out by any means, but it was one of those things where I had probably reached what I was capable of doing with that church and needed someone else to probably take it to the next level. And my co-pastor that was already with me is definitely the person to help do that. And so this was an opportunity that seemed like it was going to use my gifts and what we've been doing over the course of those 4.5 years.
I think that this idea of the call of God, I think it's absolutely vital. I think back to, for any of us, when we talk to church planners, we always say, boy, let's talk about your call because it's not easy. There's going to be rough patches. Leadership's difficult in any church leadership position you're in. And so often it's the call that keeps us in the game, if you will. But discerning that call to move, especially when you're leading, a church you've been at, that you've started, that is God's blessing. And it affects more than just you. It affects more than just your family. I remember when my wife and our family was trying to discern, should Greg Nettle transition from Rivertree, where I'd been for 25 years, Mozart, to become the president of Stadia, right? And we spent 6 months praying and fasting with the elders of Rivertree, talking to every mentor relationship I've had in my life, people we trust. And at the end of that time, I'll never forget the elders saying, not only do we recognize the call of God on Greg Nettle's life and affirm that call, but as a result, we're sending him to Stadia. And that's what you said. Not everybody liked it, right? I wish they would have been a little less quick to say, yeah, go. But but it was this beautiful thing for the body of Christ as a whole.
Yeah.
And so there is that discernment process that I think we have to be aware of. Okay, so you move, of all things, this is a dramatic life upheaval from Lincoln, Nebraska. And so where are you at in the city now of New York?
So I live in Harlem. That's in Manhattan. And so, yeah, we moved 1,300 miles away from our hometown of 300,000 people to live in New York City, where there are over 9 million people. So, yeah, dramatic change, dramatic shift. We did that in the middle of the pandemic. So in July 2020, and moved 1,300 miles away. And so there's a lot of adjustment to that, cultural adjustment, expensive adjustments as well. And that sort of thing. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, but you're, how big's your house you're living in now in New York City?
In New York City, for New York, it's big. I live not in a house, but in I'm in a brownstone, which is basically a townhome that's split up into 3 units, and we have about 1,200 square feet. And for perspective, I moved out of probably the equivalent of a little over 3,000 square feet in Nebraska with a backyard and that sort of thing and a garage. But yeah, so it's definitely small, especially with a family of 6 and a 70-pound German Shepherd. So,
okay, wait. So you have 4 kids. What are their ages now?
Almost 11, 9, 7, and 3.
Okay, and so you're moving back, and at that point they were much younger when you moved.
Yes.
And so you're moving 4 little kids, your wife and your dog, into a 1,200 square foot townhouse in the middle of the city. Man, there's a lot of us probably going, boy, I hope God doesn't give me that call. I don't know,
Right.
talk about that decision process.
Yeah, man. So one of the things that I'm a little bit more charismatic than some, but I feel like I definitely believe I heard from the Lord first. He said that you're going to be leaving your church sooner than you think. And then I got a call from my mentor and friend about 6 weeks later. And so that was a part of it, is that I felt like I was pretty confident that I had heard from the Lord, but then going through our friendships and relationships and making sure that they're affirming that same thing, with the call to not just go to New York City, but then also to be a part of multiplying churches in that space. And so a lot of it was discernment with friends and prayerful discernment with that. And then also I usually, when there's a big move like that, I want to anchor that in a text. And so I usually spend significant time praying and asking the Lord to give me a text, that when I am in a hard time, like when it comes to moving and even just, during that time frame, my mom had actually died of cancer. And so you're talking, we moved 6 weeks after that happened. And so when those moments come, if I don't have something to anchor in, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to say yes to that. And so the text he gave me was Genesis 12:1 through 3, where he tells Abraham, leave everything that he knew. And he said, go and I will show you a land, and that you would be a blessing to many nations. And so that text has been the thing that I have to run to every time things have gotten difficult, which is a lot when you move into New York City in the middle of the pandemic. But just that he continues to say he'll show me, and he continues to unfold what that looks like for me.
Okay, so yeah, you moved to New York City. At what point in the pandemic did the move occur?
The move occurred. So we're probably, let's see, it's funny. We came for a vision trip in March of 2020. And when we were leaving, it was when the city shut down. And so it was supposed to be a full flight, but there was like 15 people, including staff, on the flight on the way back home. But from there, we moved actually July 30th. So you're talking 4 months into it, give or take. We still didn't know anything. They had just started mask ideas and that sort of thing at that point. There's no vaccinations. And so everything was still pretty closed down for the most part.
Well, I gotta ask you this. So you're moving into the city now. There's this pandemic. The city's shutting down. I mean, is your wife having second thoughts about her vision of moving into New York City?
What's funny is she's the one that probably had more solitude than I did at times, because I'm like thinking about the money. I'm thinking about the time. I'm like, look, we have a cushy space where we are. But yeah, man, there's plenty of second thoughts. Like, are we dumb? Should we be doing this? And honestly, the thing that I've clung to is that God said yes before the pandemic came, and God knew the pandemic was coming. And so if he already said yes, knowing that it was coming, then why would we come back and say, well, you know what, maybe we should second guess this thing. And I mean, since my early days in ministry, one of my commitments to the Lord is that when he says go, I don't ask how high necessarily. I just go and see how he provides that process. And
Yeah,
I mean, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I just, one of our family values is always say yes to God. And I always tell people it's often not easy. It's often not easy. It's often painful, but it's always good. It's always good.
Yep.
And if,
That's exactly right.
if we could say anything to our church starters and church leaders today, Julie and I have never, ever regretted saying yes to God in something that he's called us to.
No, not at all, man. I mean, there's plenty. I mean, obviously you have to grieve stuff. Like one of the things that I learned even in the process of church planting is that there are pain points that have to be grieved and lamented and then experience God's grace in the midst of that. And if you don't do that, yeah, it will come up later. But even in that, yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, I don't know if there's ever been a regret for the move. There's been plenty of points of continued grieving and processing and that sort of thing. But no, there's no regret in saying yes. God is incredibly gracious through all of that. And there's I think sometimes when you're in it, you're like, man, are these Jesus people sugarcoating this stuff?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's like, no, it hurts, man. We're not sugarcoating it. It hurts, but it's definitely been worth it. All the things that we had hoped that God would do, he definitely has exceeded expectation.
Okay, let's shift gears just a little bit, because as I've gotten to know you, one of the things I've appreciated is your family has family values and mission and vision for your future, and you're making decisions based on that. Talk to us about what that is, how you've developed it, and how it kind of guides you.
Yeah. So during the pandemic, one of the things that we set out to do is say, hey, we won't not learn from this experience, both in the move, but then also just the pandemic alone, it created some rhythms and some vibes for us. We've always been really family centric, but at the same time, we've kind of followed the lead of my vocation most of the time when it comes to it, and kind of worked around that. But one of the things that we prayed through is what would it look like to have a life that is centered around our not our children, but our whole family unit. And so because, church planters, typically strategic thinkers in some way, form or fashion, the only way I could think of it was like, hey, we need a vision, we need values. And so, our vision for our family is that we be global kingdom dwellers without a cap. Meaning that, hey, we want to not only experience and see the globe, but we want to see the kingdom, from a global perspective. More and more, we're starting to see we're more and more connected. The world is shrinking. And as I've experienced it, and so has my family, when you have multiple perspectives from the image of God, you get to see God more. You get to see more clearly even in how his grace manifests based on culture and ethnicity and even just a regional space. And so New York's provided some of that, but we want to continue to see that develop through our family. And so our mission is to see the image of God and its grace, so that we might learn from it and multiply disciples in it. And so we've developed that as just a huge value for us. And so a lot of our decisions based on neighborhood, based on who we hang out with, based on even our weekly rhythms as a family, those things revolve around that idea of being global kingdom dwellers. And so we have a diverse friend group. I swear, I think I have more Korean friends than I've ever had in my entire life because I live in New York City. And there's about probably 5 to 7 different languages spoken on the block that we live on. And then there's just nuance to that, right? Culture and ethnicity and those things that go with that. And so, yeah, we're trying to continue to flesh that out. Obviously, we haven't completely figured everything out. I don't think anyone has, but nonetheless, that is something that New York has provided, and even just the setting of trying to flesh out, hey, why are we here as a family? And honestly, Greg, I look at my kids. I gave you the spectrum of age. We have anywhere from 7 to around 15 years or so with each kid left. And so how do we best invest in those next generation of leaders and disciple makers, and world, who have a world vision? I don't want our kids to have a cap on them and say, hey, the only place we can go is here because this is all we know. We want them to know more than that.
So, I mean, how did you come up with the vision and the mission? I mean, did you go off in a corner in the pandemic and write it, or, was it collaboration? How did it come together?
Yeah, it was collaborative. So what I did honestly is I spent a lot of time listening to my wife. It's just listening to her talk about things. She was spewing visions and dreams of things that she wanted for our family, and things that I believe that she sought the Lord on. And she's got a very huge intuition and discernment to her. She's had that throughout our entire marriage and family experience so far. And so in listening to that, I said, okay, so how do I synthesize that in some statements that something that I tell church planners, like if it's not written down, it's not real. Because we all have a lot of dreams and visions, but if you can't write it down, it's probably not that well fleshed out. It's still just an idea. And so I wanted her dreams and our dreams that we've talked, over the last 2 years about to be really crystallized. And so that when we make decisions, that we make decisions through that grid. And so, yeah, man, there was definitely prayer, but I don't know, it was more organic than it was actually intentional until I said, okay, if I'm telling these people that I'm coaching up that if it's not on paper, it's not real, then I better start to put it on paper too. And so I put it down on paper, just fleshed it out as much as I could over the course of a few days. And then I sent it to my wife and said, hey, what do you think? Do you think this articulates what we've been dreaming, what we feel like the Lord is leading our family toward? And she affirmed it all, edited it because she's better at English than I am. She's definitely a better speller too. And so she had to put her thumb on it for sure, but it definitely was a team effort by our family as well, because we listen to our kids too and some of their dreams and desires.
Okay, so and then do you communicate that with your children? Like, do they know, hey, this is the way our family's structured and our mission, vision, and values?
Yeah, probably not in the way we would probably do with a church. We kind of drip it in, like I was telling you before, about how we did with the church as far as that's concerned. Like it wasn't like, hey, here's a whole list of things. I don't know if that would necessarily resonate with that. But we do remind them on a consistent basis of our values of kindness and generosity and love and caring for people who are different than us and that sort of thing. So yeah, the values are definitely communicated on a continual basis, whether it's in a moment of disobedience or a moment of like, hey, here's a coaching moment, or even celebrating when they respond that in a way that looks like our vision and our values fleshed out. And then beyond that, we definitely have communicated with them a sense of excitement and enjoyment of saying, hey, like we want to invest our family in from a global perspective. And so they come home telling us about the different friends that they make at school, and we go into friend environments where, hey, they're going to make food different than what we're used to, but we're embracing that beauty because they bear the image of God, and we're going to learn something about God and them in the process. So yeah, I would say we definitely communicated, probably just not in like a sit down vision meeting necessarily, like you would do organizationally speaking.
But so that's the hard work, right? When we talk about, we do a lot of this from a standpoint for our churches or our leadership, and we work on vision and mission and values, or at least I hope everyone does. And it is a lot of work to put that down on paper and get it to agreement and then get people moving in that direction. But man, one of the things I've discovered over the years, it is absolutely vital to do that work. And recently, I literally sat down and, I'm very futuristic. So I looked at the next 10 years of my life and I said, okay, here's 10 years from now, here's what I want Stadia, God, here's what I believe you're calling Stadia to, what it's going to look like. Here's where I believe you're calling our personal life to, and then strategically worked backwards and said, okay, to get to that point, here's the steps along the way. Now, interesting, if you talk to a real hard driver, they'll say, yeah, work those steps. And then I talked to a spiritual director and they said, yeah, but understand that God can shift those steps and all that stuff in it. But the reality was I spent several weeks working through that to get it down on paper. And man, I just can't tell you how important that is. And we do it a lot of times for our vocation, as you said, but not necessarily in our personal lives. Now, Mozart, let's do this. I want you to go back to when you were first starting that church in Lincoln, Nebraska. And what do you know now that you wish you would have known then?
Oh man, there's a lot of things, but one of my primary things that I had to learn that I wish I knew early on is multiplication. While it is beautiful and good, because the gospel propels us toward it, it also causes an immense amount of grief. And so one of the things that I learned the hard way, because I went through failure, essentially was at each point that we sent a whole team out or multiplied a group, there was still loss involved in that. So you have friendships who are just going to organize differently after that. There's going to be relationships that actually were just for a season that have multiplied on to the next thing. And while that's exciting and good because new people are going to come to faith in Christ and there's going to be baptisms, you still have a loss at the place of multiplication. And walking people through that is so important. And I think I hard charged through some of those feelings and emotions to the detriment of friendships and relationships and even some of my staff, even to some degree. And we just, I think maybe seeing the celebration and the grieving not as opposites, but as two units that are needed for healthy multiplication.
Man, that is gold, Mozart. I had to learn that same lesson the hard way. And if you're there now, hear that great wisdom from Mozart Dixon. Okay, Mozart, I love just you sharing today, and I love your heart for ministry. I can't wait to see what God has in store for you next and for your family and the kingdom builders they're going to be. Thanks for being on the Church Planting Podcast, Mozart.
Appreciate the time, Greg, man. This is great.